What you're about to watch is some advice on planning for first year English from the JCT English team. As you can imagine, I will make lots of references to learning outcomes, so you might find it helpful to have the English specification or the 22 learning outcomes for first year in front of you. The approach we suggest here is just one of many possible ways to approach planning. But no matter what approach you take to planning, these first two pieces of advice will remain important. The first thing you need to consider is the junior cycle in your specification, and more specifically, the learning outcomes laid out within the spec. There are 39 learning outcomes to be addressed over the course of the 3-year programme. They're divided into 3 strands: oral language, reading and writing, and there's a subset of 22 learning outcomes. Your first year plan only needs to make provision for these 22. These 22 were designed to build on previous learning, supporting first year students in the transition from primary school. And remember, these 22 learning outcomes which we're focusing on in first year will not be completed at the end of the year. They will continue to support the student's language development right through the 3 years of junior cycle and beyond. The second crucial thing to focus on as you plan can also be found in the specification. In planning a course, a teacher will take account of the need to provide a wide range of opportunities for students to have meaningful and stimulating language experiences across a broad range of texts. The guidelines provided should be used to inform our choice of texts. The first year experience should include a studied novel as well as sustained reading of novels throughout the year. They should also study a variety of drama extracts and a variety of non-literary texts. These can include advertisements, short films, oral text, posters, etc. Students should also study a number of short stories and at least 10 poems. I should mention that there's an indicative list of novels for first year. As you know, there's a list of prescribed texts for second and third year, but this first year list is indicative. You can choose a novel from these titles, or you can choose any other novel which you deem appropriate. So once you've done the 2 crucial steps of looking at the learning outcomes and then looking at the guidelines for first year, you can really begin your planning as a subject department. The 7 steps that I'm about to outline are just one possible approach to planning. So here's step 1. Look at your year planner. We found it helpful to plan for 5 units of work, but term lengths vary from year to year, so it's wise to think about how long each half term is before you begin planning. Step 2 is to choose themes for your units. Now, we decided to plan thematically, but that's not essential. If you prefer another approach, then that's okay too. In this case, we went with a nice introductory unit called Who Am I for the first half term, then Growing Up, then Love in the half term that contains Valentine's Day, and then as we move into spring, we'll look at Nature, and then Dreams and Ambitions in the summer term. Step 3, with the guidelines in mind, think about texts. Well, the first and biggest text within the guidelines is a studied novel, so we decided to go with one of the novels from the indicative list, Wonder by R.J. Palacio. So we slotted it into the Growing Up unit. And we knew we'd need some drama extracts too, so we planned to use those here, here and here. We decided to use a short story such as Fish Cheeks by Amy Tan here in the Growing Up unit. And with the themes we'd chosen, we could see that there'd also be rich possibilities for short stories here, here and here. The guidelines require us to expose first year students to at least 10 poems over the course of the year. So now is a good time to commit to building poetry into most of our units. And again, the themes that we've chosen will lead us a bit in our distribution of poems. For example, I would like to include something like Titchmiller into this unit because I think it would fit nicely with Wonder. But as it's only a 7.5-week term, I'll restrict myself to just 1 poem in here. I'll add another one here, but I think that the theme of love and the theme of nature will be very rich grounds for poetry, so I'm sure we can find 2 more on Dreams and Ambitions. Next, we'll commit to some non-literary text throughout the units. I can see the Wonder book trailer working really well here, or perhaps the Doc on One, A Farther Education. And then we can put our heads together as a department to source suitable non-literary text for the other units. And of course, we know that subject departments will take this opportunity to have discussions about how they will teach these. When teachers in your department share your approaches and successes with each other, these discussions will feed into your plan and enrich teaching and learning in your school. Step 4. Plan how to address the 22 learning outcomes. If you have the learning outcomes in front of you, you may find it helpful to pause to read each outcome as I mention them. Planning using these outcomes can initially seem daunting, but the whole process becomes more meaningful when subject departments really engage with it. In this first half term, we want to get to know the first years, and we want them to get to know each other, so we thought that a focus on oral learning outcomes would be helpful. Oral 5 requires them to deliver some kind of oral text alone or in a group, and we think it's a good idea to practice this skill early and often. It needn't be a big event, but we wanted to send new students the message that we value what they say as much as what they write. Try not to include too many learning outcomes into your plan for each unit. Too many will be unwieldy and might dilute your focus too much. We've already placed our studied novel here in the Growing Up unit. So when we looked at the learning outcomes, we saw that Oral 1 would play an important role in our discussions about this text. And, not surprisingly, when we scanned the reading outcomes, there were several that jumped out as appropriate outcomes for the study of a novel. We also knew that we'd like students to provide written responses to the text, so writing 3 and 4 were obvious choices. Oral 2 would be addressed through class discussions, as we'd explore our emotional responses to Augie's story, and Oral 7 also opened possibilities for interesting learning experiences within these texts. At this point, someone suggested that a particular radio documentary would fit nicely into this unit as a non-literary text, so we also felt that we could address Writing 1 and 11 and Oral 4 in a very organic way. And in all honesty, this was a good place to draw a line. We could keep adding learning outcomes which could be addressed in this unit, but there's a better chance that we won't let any fall through the cracks if we keep it to a more manageable number. We have the whole year to address the 22, and most will be addressed over and over again. So now in the cold, dark months of January and February, we'll approach the unit on love. As you can see, it's quite a poetry-heavy unit, so when we looked at the learning outcomes, we searched for learning outcomes that were suited to poetry. And Oral 8, Reading 1, 6 and 8, and Writing 3 jumped out at us. We thought that we could incorporate a lot of spoken poetry into this unit too, and perhaps use another radio documentary as our non-literary text, so Oral 10 and Oral 11 were added. And with the decision to emphasise oral texts in this unit, it made sense to add Writing 5, which asks students to engage with oral and written language to enrich their own written work. We added Writing 1 and 4 here with a plan to encourage students to produce some writing in different text forms while encouraging a thoughtful writing process with time to draft, redraft and edit. And now on to our nature unit. We decided that a short film called The Herd, which you can find at thisisirishfilm.ie, and perhaps a speech on an environmental issue, would be interesting non-literary texts to complement the more traditional nature poetry. Again, we scanned the learning outcomes to see what was appropriate, and Oral 8, Reading 8 and Writing 3 were very suited to film. Oral 11 and Oral 4 had a clear purpose if we were to use a speech, and we realised at this point that Reading 10 and Reading 13 had so far not appeared in our plan. Perhaps they would have been met in an incidental fashion at some stage, but we don't want to leave that to chance. So, when we as individual teachers are putting more meat onto this unit, we will endeavour to build oral language resources and also an appreciation of register into our plans. Perhaps we might ask students to identify the oral registers used in a short film, and then use the appropriate register to write a news report or a personal letter about the story. Again, this is a moment where sharing of practice can enhance teaching and learning. You might discuss how you would approach these learning outcomes. What methodologies would you use? Has anyone in your department had success in this area by using a particular strategy? And then back to the learning outcomes. We added on Writing 1, 6 and 11 because a deliberate emphasis on these would clearly have a positive impact on the writing that we just mentioned. And lastly, in the summer term, we're looking at dreams and ambitions. And again, I must admit that we had some possible texts in mind when we came up with the theme. So I know that the non-literary texts like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech will have an important place in this unit. It makes sense, therefore, that if they are to be exposed to powerful speeches, that we should ask them to engage with them as a pleasurable and purposeful activity and collaborate to discuss their understanding of them. And of course, we can then look at asking them to deliver their own oral texts in appropriate language and styles. And of course, the strands should be integrated. We won't just focus on their oral language skills. We'll ask them to learn from those models of oral language to improve their own written work. And as for reading, well, we'll again address reading 10 and 13 and also reading 5. Now, reading 5 asks students to engage in sustained private reading. And at this stage, we realised that we had committed to do that throughout the year, through library classes, regular book discussions, reading time, book in a bag, etc. So really, while we have already included it here, we now need to remedy our mistake and include it here, here, and here. Step 5 asks us to ensure that our learning outcomes are spread across the plan. And really this step is about doing a quick audit. Are all 22 included? Are there any missing or neglected? Now is the time to fix that. And step 6, populate the units with suitable texts. Now this is where your individual years of experience, not just as teachers, but also as readers, poetry lovers, film buffs, theatre goers and pop culture aficionados come to the fore. If you're lucky enough to be part of a large department, perhaps you could all take on different units here to populate with texts. Or if one member of the department is very strong in a particular area, poetry or short stories for example, then maybe that teacher could make suggestions across all the units. A sharing of experiences with different approaches to those texts, along with discussions around pedagogy, will add depth to your plan and enhance teaching and learning in your school. For our plan, we decided on an extract from Our Day Out, a wonderful short story by Julia Alvarez, the ever-popular Titch Miller, and the This Girl Can campaign, which you can find on YouTube. It's a British campaign to get women and girls moving, regardless of shape, size and ability. Badly Drawn Roy is a funny short film, kind of a mockumentary, about the difficulties faced by Roy, Ireland's only living animated character born into a live-action family. For growing up, we already have our novel, Wonder, along with a short story, a radio documentary and a poem. You can see the eclectic tastes of the department here as the Love unit puts some modern texts alongside some texts that are more traditional. And here in the Nature unit we have the classic Liam O'Flaherty short story, along with a recent short film which you'll find at thisisirishfilm.ie, and of course there are plenty of options for nature poetry. We went with an extract from The Field for Dreams and Ambitions. Your class could read and discuss a scene in which the Bull McCabe vocalises his obsessive ambition to secure the rights to the field, or perhaps take a look at the thwarted ambitions of Mamie Flanagan. In Mother to Son, we hear the heartfelt advice from a mother to a son on how to keep going and strive through adversity. We have Yeats's dream of a utopian lifestyle, and then another great Irish film about an ambitious young Chinese student who dedicates himself to learning the Irish language in the belief that he'll need it to communicate when he emigrates to Ireland. And of course, we have the ubiquitous but still rousing I Have a Dream speech. So our year plan is growing in detail. But remember what I said at the beginning, this is just one approach to planning. There are other options. For example, you might, as a department, make a generic plan which says which learning outcomes and which types of texts you will each cover in each unit. And then each teacher could come up with their own personal selection of texts through which to achieve the learning outcomes. And don't be afraid to embrace teachable moments during the year. New texts and new topics often fall into our laps and into the wider public consciousness. And it would be a shame not to use them. And it would be a shame not to share some of these moments with your colleagues. How did you teach it? What worked? What didn't work? Why did it work? And did it give you ideas for other areas? So, as I said, our plan is growing in detail, but it's still missing a very important element. We know what learning outcomes we want our students to aim towards, and we know which texts we will use to support that journey, but we haven't yet discussed how to assess their learning. So the next step is step 7, align assessment with learning outcomes. For assessment to be valid, it must evaluate whether our students have learned what we set out to teach them. In other words, to what extent have they realised the learning outcomes? So for each of these units, we must now come up with ways to evaluate the learning. The important thing is to look at a learning outcome, or a set of them, and to come up with some form of assessment that have clearly grown out of those learning outcomes. We'll take a look at one of these units up close to do this. So here we have the September unit. As a department, we've agreed on these learning outcomes and these texts, and now we need to think about how best to evaluate the learning. In some cases, teacher observation might be enough to assess them in this particular term. We could assess Oral 5 and Writing 3 and 9 by asking students to make a photo story or Animoto. If you take a look at those learning outcomes, you can see how we're making an effort to align the assessment task that we've set to the learning outcomes. Asking students to write a blog like this could assess a wide range of learning outcomes. Something as straightforward as write a letter advising any of the characters on a problem that they're having could assess Reading 5, Writing 3 and Writing 10. And you could also ask students to keep a response journal. Perhaps a reflective self-assessment process could be used here. And so, to summarise, each unit should have a carefully selected set of learning outcomes and a selection of text to support the learning. And when it comes to assessment, there are a wide range of ways to assess to what extent students have achieved the learning outcomes that you set out to teach them. What's important is that you show a clear alignment between the assessment and the learning outcomes. I hope that you have found this screencast useful. You can find further supports at jct.ie.